Kia ora, welcome to the State of the Nation, the New Zealand Initiatives podcast. He's Oliver Hartwich, Executive Director, and my favourite Tory, especially my favourite German Tory, I'd have to say, Oliver.
Well, thank you very much, Josie. And she's, of course, Josie Pagani, and Josie's my favourite left-winger. So great to have you on this podcast.
You're probably the only person who's called me a left-winger in a long time. Well, the Labour Party might disagree. But
and you haven't really called me a right-winger, but a Tory, and I'm not quite sure about that.
But you're definitely German, originally.
Yeah, but I've got a New Zealand passport too now, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, and you look lovely. You look very well-dressed for a German Tory, but you've got fantastic shoes.
Which you can't see now, but they are English, actually. Yeah. They are proper Tory shoes.
They're
from
red
Northampton.
strip, like your tie.
Yeah, I like shoes, and actually I probably should get more shirts because I know that I shouldn't wear striped shirts, so I cover that.
So what we're trying to do with this podcast, Oliver, is model good debate between the left and the right. And it strikes me, this is so hard to do these days.
What is a good debate? Will we both leave the studio alive?
And still talking.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, we might do this again.
Yeah. But I do think it's really hard. There was a lovely article from Liam Dan over the weekend where he talked about how is it we all want the same thing. We want prosperity for New Zealand. We want less poverty. We want people to get a fair go.
Good education, clean environment.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
so,
sure.
So we all agree on the outcome we want, and really what we're debating on the left and the right is sort of the yin and yang of politics. I see it. It's like sometimes you're going to be right, and I'm going to concede that you're right about something, and sometimes I'm going to be right, and you're probably not going to concede that I'm right.
Yeah, and sometimes in the grand scheme of things, with the yin and yang, I feel like the little dots in the middle, when the left and the right are both wrong. And I'm actually neither left nor right wing. I think actually I'm a classical liberal, and that means you don't have a party.
So here's my first question.
Yes.
To get past polarisation, how do you define your politics?
My politics is I believe in freedom as the guiding principle, and I think it's the same whether you want to be in a same-sex marriage or whether you want to run a company. These are both aspects of freedom. So you have business freedom, you have personal freedom, you have freedom of speech, you have all sorts of freedoms, and that's my guiding principle. And sometimes that makes me a right-winger, and sometimes that makes me a left-winger.
So you're really a libertarian, you're not really a conservative.
Yeah, I don't like the libertarian word, because that's more an American term, and some libertarians are frankly weird. So, no, I think I'm an old-fashioned liberal.
I like someone described compassionate conservatism as right-wingers who say sorry. But that's not you're not a compassionate conservative so much as
I'm very compassionate.
You're very compassionate. You are a compassionate conservative. Yes.
I'm not conservative.
No, I don't. No, you're more on the libertarian side. That's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Okay. What are you then?
Well, good question. I think I'm a classic social democrat.
So in the style of.
In the style of I believe in the state, but I'm also a capitalist. I believe in the market. So I think it's always a balance between the market and the state. And I read a wonderful article from Daniel Finkelstein, who's a Tory, UK Tories.
Yeah, I know Danny.
Yeah. You know Danny personally?
Yeah, of course, because I worked in the UK.
Right. So he wrote a great piece saying that the idea that being on the right of politics simply means tax cuts. It doesn't, right? It means the values, the conservative or right-wing values that he talks about are, stability, financial stability, but institutions, strong institutions, rule of law, all of these things that are really popular, actually. Like I can go, yeah, I support that.
Yeah, but it's shifted anyway. So if you look at voters these days, typically in the past, if you were on a low income, you would vote for a left-wing party. Nowadays, it's the other way around. It's actually people on high incomes that vote for left-wing parties, especially the Greens. And if you are a worker, I mean, for the few workers remaining, the right wing probably offers you a better alternative. So we've got a complete swap, actually, in political preferences.
I think it's a lot to do with the culture war, though, isn't it? It's
I mean, look at the Teal Party, the Teal independence in Australia. That's exactly that phenomenon. The richest Australian constituencies have gone to the Teals. So people who are broadly, is woke the right term? So for all of these inner city values, I'm looking for a non-offensive term for all of this.
Woke will do.
Yeah, okay, fine. Let's keep it that way. And it's quite telling, actually, that the Teal Party was successful in all of these inner city environments, but nowhere else. And I think that's a flip in political orientation that we can see across the Western world.
Yeah, I do think that the left has become, in some cases, the sort of new elite, where they're talking to the university common room rather than the smoker room, and that's part of a problem. I mean, we see it in Wellington, don't we? That Wellington has really consciously uncoupled from the rest of the country. It's voted for where in the local elections, most places voted for a right-wing mayor or a centre-right mayor. Wellington has voted for a left mayor. But it's more than that. It's a public sector, I think, that feels like it's really not necessarily... the sort of centre of government feels like it's not talking to working people. And
Wellington is a very special place now, and you can even see it in the way people dress. I mean, I'm trying to counter that, of course, with my ties. But the typical Wellington bureaucrat wouldn't wear a shirt and a tie or a suit.
Well, definitely not a tie. Tie's not business.
Ties are out. I'm the last one actually in Wellington wearing ties.
Yeah, you are. Why is this?
Because it's my inner rebellious nature.
You're rebelling by being more conservative than the Wellington Beltway.
Crazy colourful shoes and ties.
So let's get into a chat about, I suppose the most recent thing that's happened is the Labour Party conference and the announcement of $189 million over 4 years for childcare. Is this something you support in principle?
I thought it was a small step for the country and a huge step for the Labour Party. Seriously, I couldn't make sense of this. I mean, whether you like it as a policy or not, they built it as a measure to tackle inflation and to help New Zealand with the cost of living crisis. And so what you do is you target it very narrowly and give how many families, 10,000 or so, some support. It didn't make much sense, to me at least, because I thought, well, if you're really concerned about the cost of living crisis, I would have a few ideas on how you could deal with that. I mean, starting with the Reserve Bank. We can talk about the Reserve Bank later. But that policy on its own didn't really make much sense. And I heard a government minister actually on one of the radio programs afterwards saying, yeah, but it was just the first step because wait for the budget. Well, the budget is next May. And do we really want to wait until then to really get serious about the cost of living?
So I think what they're doing politically is that they've managed to trap National by coming out with a very timid policy. So National can't then turn around and say, big spend Labour Party, don't vote for them, they'll spend all your money and they'll be more inflationary. So they can honestly, Labour Party can honestly say this is not going to be particularly inflationary. It's a small targeted policy that helps a certain number of people. Where I think we agree is that I would want to see something far more of a systemic change that actually solves the problem. And for me,
so
it would be
for
me, it would be tax, but it would be restructuring the tax system.
So you want a tax-free threshold?
A tax-free threshold, but you've got to pay for it, right? So I get it. This is the UK Tory lesson, right? You can't cut tax, deal to debt, and keep public spending going all at the same time. You do have to sort of be realistic about.
And especially if you're going to introduce a tax-free threshold, it's going to be ridiculously expensive.
So I would go for a tax switch, Oliver, which I know you will disagree with. But I would go, because New Zealand, surely you would concede or accept that in New Zealand, it's wage earners and people on an income who are paying the bulk of tax. Right? That's, I mean, compared to other countries, we burden our wage earners with tax by far compared to others. So I would like to see a more balanced tax system where we are taxing some kind of, whether it's a land tax, some kind of wealth, but whether it's a land tax, whether it's a capital gain. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that we don't have any kind of capital gains tax, that we treat income from different sources differently.
That's difficult to design. That is very difficult to design a wealth tax. I mean, a wealth tax, from experience, we know it takes more to administer a wealth tax than to actually raise revenue.
What about land tax? Even who was it who said all taxes are terrible, but of all the taxes, a land tax is the best?
Well, we do have a land tax already. We've got a rate system, of course. I mean, that's effectively a land tax. I'm not quite sure whether that works. If I wanted to shift things, I would probably increase GST and cut income taxes. We've had a bit of that, of course, a few years ago, but I think we could go further.
That's still going to hurt your wage earners, right? If you're increasing consumption tax, why would you not look at the tax system in New Zealand and go, we're taxing people going up the hill, making their wealth. So we're taxing the wealth earners of tomorrow. but we're not taxing those who've already made their wealth at the top of the hill.
Well, I think
why would we not tax them just a little bit?
We are taxing people at the top of the income pyramid quite a lot, actually, because if you look at it, I haven't got the precise figures with me, but if you look at the top 10% of income earners, they cover the bulk of all income taxes paid. Because we also, of course, have working for families, and that cuts quite a bit at the bottom.
So there's a question. So you support then the state subsidising companies or subsidising the fact that we don't have high enough wages, which I would rather not have working for families. I'd rather have higher wages, right? But if you don't have
I would
high
like
enough
to have
wage,
higher wages. By the way, that's another reason to actually try to keep income taxes relatively low, because if we then also increase our taxes to the point of, say, Australia, then there's absolutely no reason for people to stay in New Zealand, and that would actually increase the brain drain towards Australia, because then they will have same kind of tax rates where previously we were quite a bit lower, and they will also have higher wages, and I think that will just increase the pull factor from Australia.
Yeah, I mean, in the same way that it's really hard to have a conversation about what you do about climate change, I sometimes find that it's really hard to have a conversation with my right-wing friends about what you do about tax, because it compared to other countries, it is the balance does seem out. That
I've got a great idea what we can do about that.
Yeah.
Let's have a tax working group.
Let's just have a working group.
I mean, seriously, we've discussed this before.
Yeah.
I mean, how many working groups on tax have we had in the last 20 years?
Yeah.
3 or 4 by my count, something like that, on all sorts of taxes actually, and including on the wealth tax, on the capital gains tax. We've discussed all of this before. We can't really lead this easily to a conclusion, I guess. And by and large, I think the tax system as it stands is not so bad. I mean, we've got a very clean GST system, for example. I mean, compare that with the madness going on in the UK with VAT, or compared to the Australian GST. So some aspects of New Zealand tax are not so bad. At least the system is quite clean.
I mean, I do the poll that came out this week after the Labour Party conference, it was a News Hub poll, I think, saying that most New Zealanders would support a tax-free threshold of say, the first $10,000 to $20,000. But I think what we're agreeing is that the Labour Party policy, while no one's going to disagree with helping families with childcare, it doesn't really change. It doesn't move the dial, does it?
No.
But I don't think Labour wanted to. I think they wanted to prove that they were timid and safe, and therefore, people can vote Labour because they're not going to be a transformational Labour government, which they've proved. Let's face it.
If they were serious about cost of living, they wouldn't have reappointed Adrian Orr. I mean, there is a Reserve Bank governor who's missed his target massively. We are now running above 7% inflation. It would be actually closer to 8% had it not been for the temporary fuel duty cut. And the target range, we should not forget, is between 1% and 3%. And so what you do when you miss your target consistently for a long period of time, when you've got absolutely no chance of getting back to target, of course you get another 5-year term. So really, if Labour was serious at all about the cost of living crisis, they would have found a different governor. So
for the record, you have degrees in law and economics. Mm-hmm. I have a degree in political theatre. But let's have a discussion.
Well, that's a very good combination.
So let's have a discussion about monetary policy.
Okay.
I did go back to university, actually, the last few years and get a graduate certificate in international law because I thought I needed a real qualification.
Congratulations.
But there we go. So, yes, Adrian Orr. I know that New Zealand's Initiative, you've written a lot recently and challenging stuff about monetary policy and the Reserve Bank and what should have been done during COVID. But would you not have done a stimulus to support businesses and wages through COVID?
Of course.
Would you have done that? You would have done that.
We are on the record. We supported it at the beginning of COVID. I think the problem was actually that we misread the crisis. Okay, I'm willing to forgive anything that happened in the period from about March to about May 2020. We thought the world's coming to an end. We didn't know how this pandemic would play out. This was uncharted territory. Okay, you make mistakes and you're experimenting and you have no rule book to play by. However, by about May, certainly June, July 2020, it became quite clear what this crisis really is.
Of which year?
2020.
2020.
So we're talking about the early stages of the pandemic, and it became clear we are not dealing with a demand slump. That's not what it was. It was a supply crisis, a supply shock. And we know from experience, if you're stimulating an economy in a supply crisis, well, what you do is you're pushing up all prices in the economy. And that's exactly what happened. And so I think the government and especially the Reserve Bank misread the crisis and kept pumping money into the economy when it was clear that all of this wall of money would just meet a supply crisis.
But what Adrian Orr and the Reserve Bank, what they were weighing up with the dual mandate, which I know you don't support, but we'll come to that, but they were weighing up, do we make it, the risk of getting it wrong is we make a mistake and we get inflation, the risk of getting it wrong the other way, where we don't support the economy, we don't support businesses and wages, is that we have a massive recession and people hurt, businesses fall over and communities suffer, right? So the risk of getting it wrong one way was a lot less, right? They took a gamble. I think it was the right gamble. But
I'm so glad you challenged me on that.
but I think what you're saying is that you would support that to a certain extent, but you would have cut back stimulus a lot sooner. That's what you've said in the New Zealand Initiative report.
Yeah.
So when would you have pulled back? When would you have tightened?
Well, first of all, I think that story...
In hindsight, easy to say
not
yeah.
in hindsight. We actually said it at the time. What you say is the conventional story that the Reserve Bank kind of weighed up. Okay, we can support the economy and that will probably trigger some inflation down the track, or we can let the economy go to hell in a handcart. Unfortunately, that's not how the Reserve Bank argued at the time. So you can go back through their publications throughout 2020, 2021. The Reserve Bank never flagged the possibility of inflation. They didn't see that there was a choice to be made. They thought, no, we can have this, and inflation will not move.
Did the US Fed? Did the ECB?
No, none of them really saw it coming.
So no one saw it coming.
So they didn't make that kind of decision, or we can do this and risk that, or we do the other stuff and risk that. The Reserve Bank didn't even show any consideration that there was some choice to be made. They thought, no, we'll get away with that. So I think that narrative now, that they were heroically doing something knowing that there are risks. That's not true because they didn't acknowledge the risks at the time.
So assuming you're right that central banks across the world did not have that discussion early in 2020, that they were weighing up the risks of more inflation or the risks of crashing the economy. Even if that's right, it's still, looking back, those were that was the framing for the decisions going forward, right? So looking back now, when would you have tightened monetary policy?
I would have tightened monetary policy probably around late 2020, early 2021. And I say that because that's actually what central banks should have done according to the Taylor rule. So in economics, we've got a simple tool that allows central banks to calculate where the OCR, so the official cash rate, should be. And you basically feed all of your data into this formula, and it tells you roughly where the OCR should be. And when you go back the last 20-odd years of New Zealand monetary policy, the Reserve Bank typically stayed within plus minus 1% of that Taylor rule OCR. Right. Except in 2021, they started completely deviating from that, and they're currently about 3.5% above where it should be. Below the Taylor rule. So the Taylor rule is about 3.5% above where the OCR currently is. Right. And that gap started to build up from about 2021, early 2021. So at that stage, it became quite clear that the Reserve Bank settings were removed from where a reasonable central bank would set interest rates.
So I know that you campaigned quite strongly against the dual mandate. So inflation, price stability, and sustainable employment level, right? So if we'd only had one mandate in 2020, the Reserve Bank would not have been able, under its mandate, to do anything about supporting the employment during
there was
COVID,
nothing
right?
to support actually more in 2021.
But if the government had been chucking money at wage subsidies, which they did, wage subsidies supporting businesses and so on, massive stimulus, under the single mandate, surely the Reserve Bank, the only option they would have had is to tighten monetary policy then. So they would have actually cancelled out.
No.
Cancelled out any stimulus during 2020?
Not at all. In 2020, if you look back to what the Taylor rule prescribed back then, that's exactly where the Reserve Bank ended up. They started deviating from it towards the end of 2020, early 2021. So I'm not judging the Reserve Bank on what they did in the early stages of COVID, but by the end of that first COVID year, they should have realized, actually, no, we're going too far.
Right, but I mean, what I mean is, in principle, with a single mandate, you're always going to have monetary policy and fiscal policy in a crisis working against each other.
Not necessarily. No, I think
But it's
actually
harder to go.
no.
our
But
priority.
seriously, what would you do with a dual mandate? You know, and economists have known since the 1970s that you cannot actually influence employment, even in the medium term, with monetary policy. There is a very
No, but you can cancel out what government. I mean, you can make it harder for government.
Well, actually, no, the Reserve Bank makes it harder for government to achieve its targets. I mean, coming from Germany and having studied economics in Germany, one of the sayings that I've heard again and again in my years at university was a quote from German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt in the 1970s. That was a time in the early 70s when politicians and some economists believed you could actually target both employment and monetary stability. And Helmut Schmidt said, if I have the choice between 5% unemployment and 5% inflation, well, I take the 5% inflation. The irony was, a year later, he had both, because he had built up the expectations of higher inflation and then unemployment rose. So actually, we have known this really since the late 1970s, that actually in the medium term, you cannot have a choice between the two. What a central bank should do is should actually target monetary stability, and then employment will be okay.
Do you believe in a natural rate of unemployment?
Depending on how you define it. I mean, if you mean that there are some people who you will always struggle to reintegrate into the labor market because of maybe substance abuse issues and wrong qualifications, and of course frictional unemployment where people are just between jobs, that will always be there.
That's a reality.
That will always be there.
Yeah, but isn't it, as a monetarist, don't you believe, if you believe in price stability as the single mandate, then you believe also that there is a natural rate of unemployment that's above which inflation will happen.
No,
Isn't that the difference between a dual mandate and a single
Josie, the
mandate?
first disagreement is actually I'm not even a monetarist. I'm an Austrian school economist.
Actually, which reminds me of a lovely quote from J.K. Galbraith, I think, when Hayek, the monetarist, came back.
No, Hayek was not a monetarist.
Wasn't he?
No, he was an Austrian school economist.
Right, but he's beloved he's the hero of the monetarists.
No,
right?
that's Milton Friedman.
But Hayek too, I thought.
No, no.
I'm not going to argue with you about the history of economists. But
okay, your next degree you're going to study for is going to be monetary economics.
I'm going to come back with all the facts and figures. But he was in a conference in Vienna, I think, and Galbraith thanked him for going to America because it meant that Austria could have a period of growth and stability in the economy.
Yeah, that sounds very much like J.K. Galbraith.
Yes.
Yeah. No. Let's leave that.
Let's leave a debate on. So yes, you're what were you saying? I can't remember now.
I said that we said all the things at the time. There was no hindsight economics involved. I mean, I love this phrase from Grant Robertson's hindsight economics. No, it's not hindsight economics. Actually, when he accused us of that, I was just digging through our website, finding out all the op-eds and press releases and publications we produced over the last 3 years, and I could actually point to, we said this in 2019 when Orr started talking about QE, even before COVID, and then we raised this repeatedly in 2020, 2021, 2022, and we always said, no, this is always going to end in inflation, and you are actually losing track. And we said that, and we were probably the only ones saying it at the time when people thought everything's going to be fine and inflation is not a problem, and hasn't been for decades, of course. No, we said that, and in hindsight, we were right.
But I think there is a good debate to be had about the dual mandate, and
it is not going to be a good debate about this.
It should be, though.
No, it's debunked. The whole thing is debunked. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in theory.
Well, the
it doesn't
Fed has
work
a dual mandate.
Yeah, but it doesn't make it any better. If they are jumping off a cliff, I mean, you're not
ECB
following.
has a dual mandate.
No, the ECB doesn't.
I thought it did.
No, it doesn't.
Oh.
No, it's in the treaty.
Ah.
No. The RBA in Australia, they have a dual mandate, but it doesn't make any sense either.
Right, but so
dual mandates are nonsense. They're complete nonsense. Political window dressing.
But why? Why? I mean,
because it sounds so good. I mean, because politicians want to say we're doing something for employment in the economy.
But as I understand it, if there is a belief that there is a natural rate of unemployment above which inflation happens. Therefore, if you have a single mandate, you are always going to have. If you've got a government trying to deal with unemployment. And a reserve bank that is only focused on price stability, it's going to say, no, I want to keep unemployment at this rate because above that we're going to get inflation. And that's my only mandate.
Turn it around. Would you then argue that a reserve bank should lower interest rates so as to artificially depress unemployment levels.
No, I think they should have a dual mandate and decide which one is the priority. And I actually agree with you, as most people do now, that most central banks should have tightened sooner, and they made a mistake, right? So the fact that they made a mistake doesn't mean that the principle of having two lenses by which you look at an economy and go, right, what's the problem we're dealing with? Are we going to have a recession and lower growth, or are we dealing with inflation?
I'm getting to the point where I wonder whether I should cancel you, because this is clearly not true. And actually, no, seriously, in economics, you would struggle to find any serious economists actually coming up with that position, because it's been seriously debunked in the last 40 years. No one I've heard since the late 1970s
Summers,
when I was 4.
Mark Carney are pretty serious economists.
But
former heads of Treasury, Reserve Bank, Bank of England, Bank of Canada.
Okay, it's nice that you're mentioning all these institutions when they've all failed on inflation. But do you want to take credit for all of that?
But what I'm saying is it's not debunked.
It is debunked. No. I mean, in theoretical economics, it's pretty clear, actually. We have seen it, what happens when a reserve bank targets unemployment. It shouldn't. It just shouldn't. This is just a political measure, and it doesn't work in economics.
So let's shift, because this week...
Yes!
Would you like a hug, Oliver?
Yeah, we can do that afterwards, Josie.
This week, we've got COP27 starting.
Exciting, huh? It's a football stadium full of people.
The trick is in the name, isn't it? The fact that it's 27 COP tells you that 26 have really pretty much failed to deliver a lowering of emissions. And I think you guys have done fantastic work on understanding...
I think we agree on that.
That we can agree on. Full stop. On understanding pricing in lowering emissions. And, I look at Canada where, there's the price of carbon, there's a carbon dividend, so, the dividend goes to citizens, to the public. So they say that the social license for pricing carbon and paying a carbon tax is really high, because you get a dividend in your own pocket. Each citizen gets a dividend.
Canada does that really well. It's coming from this country of this famous libertarian Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, that's right. The male version of Jacinda Ardern. But actually, I would say Justin Trudeau he's done a lot, actually, even though he can annoy the hell out of me. But he's done, pricing carbon. He's introducing free dental care. He introduced a much bigger early childhood education policy than the Labor government here. But anyway, that aside, COP27.
Yes.
It's very hard, isn't it, to have a discussion about what policies work in terms of lowering emission.
Yeah. So
New Zealand, we're going with basically a context where we've banned oil and gas, but in fact we've increased the use of coal. Have our emissions, I think they've lowered slightly, but not in any substantial way, and we're using more coal than we were.
That doesn't matter, because we've got an emissions trading scheme, and we've got a capped total amount of emissions.
Yes, exactly.
And therefore,
people don't understand
even
this.
if we import coal, it doesn't matter. But anyway, COP27, have you ever taken part in any of these?
No, have you?
Yes.
Have you?
Yes.
How did you get an invite?
I was working
as a German Tory, passionate conservative libertarian.
Yeah, correct, in London at the time. And I worked for a think tank, and we were engaged in climate change policy, and that's how I found myself at COP. I've forgotten what it was, maybe 12, 13, 14. Anyway, it was 2005 in Montreal. And the one thing I remember, it was bloody cold. So it was early December, and we had to take a taxi for distances I would have usually walked, but it was so cold. And the irony of having...
What climate change?
For Montreal in winter, it would have been a blessing. Anyway, so it was a giant trade fair. At the time, I think there were about 20,000 people there, and it was a big circus. It was a massive circus. And I heard that Sharm el-Sheikh, probably because the weather is better than in Montreal at this time of year, 35,000 people. And all of these COPs seem to work exactly the same way. I mean, Montreal was just like that. They meet for 2 weeks, and then the politicians fly in and fly out, and at the end of it, all the heads of government come together again, and it's a last-minute push, and then the conference gets an extra day. It's extended. I'm sure they've prepared for that. And then at 3 or 4 a.m. local time, you get some sort of solution, and then we'll meet again next year. It's a bit absurd. I mean, it's good that our governments are talking to each other. That's nice, but what is much more important is actually having decent policies on the ground domestically, like in New Zealand. So we have 98% of our economy covered by emissions trading. we've got 50% of emissions covered. The difference is because of agriculture. But what we are doing with the non-ag parts of the economy is brilliant because we have a comprehensive emissions trading scheme. It works. We have seen how it works actually just by the fact that the carbon price has gone up massively in the last 2 or 3 years, from about $20 to a bit more than $80 today. And companies, and I talk to companies all the time, are telling me that they're changing their behavior, they're changing their production processes because of that. That's exactly what you want to see. Now, the only thing missing from our wonderful emissions trading scheme in New Zealand, introduced by the Clark government, by the way, and perfected, I may say, under James Shaw's leadership as climate change minister, the only thing missing is really this kind of carbon rebate or carbon dividend or whatever you want to call this.
How do you bring agriculture into it, right?
That's the other thing that's missing. But actually, to have more acceptance and perhaps more public awareness of the scheme, what you could do is you could take the revenues and rather than putting them in a slush fund where Shaw and Robertson can do whatever they like with it, why wouldn't we want to pay that back to households just as they do in Canada? Because in that way, households would actually see that something's happening. It would help households make decisions on how to become more energy efficient themselves. Then you don't need any of the other nonsense like kind of clean car schemes or fee-based schemes or any of the other stuff. You leave it to households and say, okay, your energy prices are going up every year because of our emissions trading scheme and because carbon prices are going up, as they should. But in return, the revenue is passed back to you and you have the money to invest in any kind of energy saving technology you like.
So would you change, you change the ETS?
No, I would keep the ETS as it is.
And have introduce a carbon pricing system with dividends to the citizens?
Yeah, basically. I mean, we've got carbon pricing. It's in the ETS. Whenever you fill your car, presuming you're still driving an internal combustion engine car, you are paying for that because the petrol dealers are, of course, putting this into their prices because they have to pay for the certificates. And then you take all of that revenue from that ETS and pass it on to households and say, okay, this is your dividend now because New Zealand has a wonderfully functioning ETS.
And as you say, it's working in Canada and it's hugely popular and therefore there is huge social support, social license for doing more to lower emissions.
But we can see why we don't have that scheme here. I think the reason is, of course, a slush fund is politically very attractive. If you're a minister, you would rather like to have a slush fund of a few $1 billion you can spend on your preferred projects or bribe people into voting for you next time.
See, this is where I think the farm gate levy that the government introduced, where I think farmers and federated farmers, but they have a point of view. I think I agree that there should be someone from a farming background who is on the board deciding the price, right? Whereas at the moment it's just, I think, under the present structure that they governments propose, it's just the Climate Commission. Yeah,
and I think actually ideally what you would do, probably staggered over time, is you would move agriculture into the ETS.
Yeah, it seems crazy to me not to have a plan to ultimately move agriculture into the ETS. Otherwise, as you say, if you've got agriculture out of the ETS, what's the point of the ETS if most of our emissions, or at least some of the methane and gases, farmyard gases, are obviously coming from agriculture.
But in any case, isn't that interesting? So we have all of this stuff happening on the ground, and yet we have this massive COP27 with probably zero results. I mean, I heard James Shaw actually in a radio interview this week saying he had very limited expectations of that conference. He justified the Prime Minister not being there. Again, she's never been to a COP, unlike me. And Shaw said, well, actually, there's no point her going because, first of all, I'm going to be there as the climate change minister, and secondly, nothing's going to happen in Sharm el-Sheikh. So you kind of really wonder why this stuff is still happening.
I do think that's hurt her a bit, as the fact that she's made climate change her nuclear-free moment.
Yeah, but she went to Antarctica.
But not to ever go to a COP. I don't know. Maybe COP27 is in Hamilton West, because she clearly is not planning to go to Hamilton West very much either. So
well, that's going to be interesting, isn't it?
So yes, let's segue onto that. Although one thing I did want to say about, because I worked in aid and development for many years,
and you did some great work there.
Thank you very much. We're mutual appreciation club. And thank you for your support of what we do in aid and development. I think this is what people don't understand.
I think we're so wonderful, aren't we?
And your shoes are great.
Yeah.
And your tie. But
even though monetary
even though I can't, we disagree on monetary policy. I think we'll always disagree on monetary policy. But
until you study it.
My international law has made me far more muscular about intervening for humanitarian right. I would call myself muscular left.
Right. Okay.
In Ukraine, actually.
So anyway, what was your question?
Complete deviation here. Because I see myself as, I think, well, I'm centre left, and the centre always sounds so bland, like it's some kind of bland compromise between the right and the left that creates, it's a beige politics. Actually, the war in Ukraine has shown that the centre has been the radical, muscular voice for supporting Ukrainians with military support, with humanitarian support, and not wavering. Yes. So you think of the left in America, where you've got the progressive left who sent outrageous letter to Biden asking him to go and negotiate with Putin. I mean, how the hell did the far left end up on the same side as the far right, where you've got the Republican right saying, yep, I don't want to keep paying aid for Ukraine. Yeah. Anyway,
except in Germany. In Germany, the Greens are the most ardent supporters of Ukraine. It's the Green
that's right,
Party.
But the Greens in Germany are quite different, aren't they?
That's right. I wouldn't quite compare them with the Greens here.
They're far more pragmatic, electorally successful.
Yep, and totally committed to supporting Ukraine, including with weapons deliveries.
Here's a question for you, Oliver. I've wanted to ask you this a long time. Should New Zealand be more like Germany?
It is very much like Germany in many respects. I'm not quite sure whether I like it.
So what do you not like about the Germany-New Zealand nexus?
Well, let's put it this way.
Which is an odd nexus that I haven't heard of before, but yes.
I actually wrote a column about it. I can send it to you. My argument is actually that the countries are quite similar in some ways. So on foreign policy, Germany always regarded itself, especially after unification, as a larger version of Switzerland. So rich, prosperous, admired, and vigorously disinterested in international affairs. So that's the role that they try to play. And you can see this actually in the dealings that Germany had with Russia. So they pretended that Russia just wanted to sell the gas. There were absolutely no security implications, all fine. And actually, what do we even need an army for? So the Germans have actually run down their army and their air force and their navy to the point where German Air Force pilots actually had to train with the Automotive Association because at least they had helicopters where they could fly, because otherwise they would have lost their licenses. New Zealand's a bit like that. I mean, I'm not sure how much of an army we have left. I think we have 2 frigates left in the Navy. One of them is being repaired at the moment. We have no fighter jets. We really didn't think we need one because there were always the Australians, just in case.
Do you support bringing defence expenditure up to 2%?
Absolutely.
How do we pay for that? Or what do we cut?
Well, there's so many things I would like to cut. Let's not go there. But definitely we have to get defense up. We have to be able to defend ourselves. The other parallel sees in energy. So in energy, Germany kind of believe that they can do all sorts of virtuous things all at once. You switch off nuclear power because it's dangerous. You switch off coal-fired power stations because it's fossil fuels. And then you import gas from Russia. And it's going to be fine. They even classified gas as a sustainable energy source because of that. And in New Zealand, well, we had a very well-functioning electricity system and energy system until this government came along and decided, no, we now have to make it 100% renewable. And
for little gain.
For little gain. And then you also thought for some window dressing, you can switch off gas and you wouldn't give any more permits anymore for offshore gas exploration and oil exploration. So it was all virtue signaling. And in that respect, again, Germany and New Zealand are quite similar. So when I look at the two countries, I think they are more similar than they realize.
I do think, though, like with Germany, if you talk about energy, since we were talking about COP27, that they have a kind of all of the above approach, which is good, right? And they're bringing back, they're actually keeping their nuclear stations open for longer now.
Don't get me started.
Right, but they should, right?
They keep them running.
If you're serious about climate change, I don't think we should have nuclear power in New Zealand because we've got earthquakes. But if you seriously want to lower emissions, you have to consider.
You don't have to convince me on nuclear power.
Right?
I'm totally with you.
But they had a much better approach to what Obama. Under Obama, the energy policy was all of the above, renewables, and realistically, fossil fuels are not going to go away in a heartbeat. So we have to look at, gas is better than coal, and so on. So Obama had a very realistic approach to energy. I think Germany does too. I don't think
Germany doesn't have a realistic
But they have now, haven't they? They're kind of they're keeping their nuclear power
for how
stations
long?
open.
For 3 months. For an extra 3 months, they were supposed to be switched off New Year's Eve this year. And they now let them run for another 3 months.
So you don't think they'll extend it longer?
Probably not, because they're quite ideological about it.
But I would have thought now there is even, you'll have green parties, you'll have green campaigners supporting nuclear power for exactly the reason that they want to lower emissions and do a faster transition.
You have campaigners like even Greta Thunberg arguing for nuclear power. She was on German TV a few weeks ago saying it is madness to switch off nuclear power. And of course, the German Greens hated her for that. But it was the first time that I ever agreed with Greta Thunberg. And the German Greens wouldn't listen. They come out of the anti-nuclear movement from the 1970s and 80s. And for them, it's really a sacred cow. You can't slaughter that sacred cow. And therefore, Germany would switch off nuclear power, even though it's practically the only baseload they still have. And that, of course, increases the risk of blackouts. And by the way, we just had a story in New Zealand saying the same. So we have invested mightily in wind energy. And now we find that it fluctuates because sometimes, surprise, surprise, the wind doesn't blow. And Germany finds that too. It's really strange. Sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. It's called night. And if you've got night and there's no wind, then you've got a problem because there's no more baseload in this country.
And this is how hard it is to have this conversation, that if you want to massively accelerate renewables, you have to have the intermittent energy source that's going to be there when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining.
And that is exactly what would have made it so expensive to go to 100% renewable in New Zealand, because the last 2-3 percentage points, they will cost you an arm and a leg.
Yeah, exactly.
They will break you.
Yeah.
You will go bankrupt first before you become carbon neutral.
That's what I was going to say, having worked in aid and development, that it seems to me the big thing that's lacking in the global climate approach is money to developing countries to transition off coal, burning peat in Indonesia. I mean, if we could actually honour our commitments to paying developing countries, or paying China not to build more coal plants, we would do more to lower emissions than just about anything we're doing in New Zealand. I'm not saying we should do stuff in New Zealand. Each country should do stuff, but that's the priority.
Massively cheaper.
Massive priority.
So instead of going through schemes like the Clean Car Rebate Scheme, which according to, I think, ACT's calculation now costs $125,000 a ton.
Yes, but also people are buying a Tesla for $70,000 and getting an $8,000 subsidy from a Labour government.
Correct.
That to me is...
You probably have to drive it for at least 80,000 kilometers until you even compensate for all the emissions in the production process, because actually producing the battery, the giant battery for Tesla, that is very carbon intensive.
So COP27, we've done that. We're not expecting anything. James Shaw will be back, next week or shortly? Yeah, I mean, nothing's going to change particularly.
No,
yeah.
They will meet again.
Yeah. What's the one thing that you would do now in New Zealand to lower our emissions?
I think I would continue on the path we're on. I would make sure that the public actually understands what's happening with the ETS. The problem with the ETS, it's a beautiful system. It's beautifully designed. It delivers the goods and nobody understands it. Because it takes about 2 or 3 minutes to explain it to the average voter. And until the average voter understands how the ETS works, the voters are going to be more susceptible to supporting policies that simply don't work, and that's what's going to make it really costly. So if you have alternative policies, complementary policies to the ETS, that will cost us maybe $400 or $500 a ton, then voters should know how nonsensical that is, because they should say, hang on, why are you spending all of this money on cutting a ton of carbon there when actually you could cut 5 or maybe 10 tons of carbon with the ETS?
Yeah, I agree. We agree on that.
All right, that's good.
So, final question. Rather than talking about Hamilton West, which we could get into, but Mark Carney, former Reserve Bank, former central banker for Canada and the UK, Larry Summers. I've been at meetings with both of them in the last few months, and they have both predicted a global recession next year. Do you agree?
I think it's looking increasingly likely because the world economy is in really difficult circumstances at the moment. We have record levels of debt. We have rising interest rates around the world. We had the Jackson Hole conference, of course, where all the central bankers came together and said we have to do something about inflation because we can't let it spiral out of control. It would just make it more expensive to deal with it later. So if you put all of that together, that means that circumstances in 2023 are going to be even tougher. And on top of that, we've got supply chain disruptions. Still, as long as China maintains its zero COVID approach,
which it looks like it will.
It looks like it, even though...
And it'll become more isolated.
Even though I had a bit of hope. I thought once they're done with their party congress and she is re-elected for life, that makes it a bit easier for him to do things after the election. It used to be like that with politicians, and I thought it would work like that in dictatorships too. So theoretically, it should have made it easier for him to deviate from his old policy after the Congress. So maybe there's still some hope that China actually gets off it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, another issue that would be good to talk about at some point is the need to reset our trade policy, right? Well, we have to diversify away from simply being so dependent on China, but also trade deals. I mean, globalization has taken a big hit. I think the age of FTAs, of high-quality FTAs are gone. I mean, we haven't signed anything that's worth its weight in gold. I mean, we have the EU trade deal is weak.
Yep.
We're looking at one with Latin America. It looks equally weak. There's nothing on the horizon that looks like we're going to be able to re-enter a kind of intelligent globalization post-COVID, is there?
And that's in a way sad that we're talking about FTAs, because once upon a time we talked about at least some multilateral deals or maybe global deals. I mean, the WTO is effectively dead, and it will take a long time for it to come back, if it comes back at all. It's sad that we are at this stage where the best we can hope for is a slightly better FTA with a few countries. There was a time not so long ago when we talked about globalization, about the world being flat, and all of this hope from the 90s is gone. So actually I share that sentiment that it's a really, really tough environment out there for trade.
A great quote from Larry Summers when I saw him recently, where he said, you know, with globalization, we need globalization to keep working. We need to make sure that it's benefiting the many, not the few. The response that we mustn't have, it's like when you go to the butcher and the butcher doesn't have beef, you don't go and buy your own cow, right? You find another butcher, right?
Correct.
So his point is, you know, we cannot take the lesson from COVID and the isolationist approach to trade and post-COVID. The lesson from that can't be that we have to make everything ourselves.
Yeah,
you know,
and
go and find our own cow.
And the other lesson from Ukraine is, of course, that you wouldn't want to become as dependent on Russia as Germany was.
Yeah.
So not with any other country, and not just for energy. We have to be careful, especially when we're dealing with autocracies. Yes, they might want to trade with us for a while, but they can turn nasty quite quickly.
Well, you guys, I know, we've argued about how you increase wages with a long email trail arguing about, you know, whether or not actually lifting wages is a good idea. I think it is. You think the answer is...
I think it's productivity.
Productivity, and I agree with you, but productivity is a long-term thing. I've been talking about productivity in media commentary for 10 years. But it seems to me now, if we've got this problem with...
Just shows how young you are.
Rethink our trade policy, we've got to
I know economists who've talked about this in New Zealand for 40 years.
Yeah, well, I know. If I'd known more, I would have been talking about it for longer. But
I
I've
can
been
tell you
only
a
talking
story,
about
actually.
it coherently for 10 years.
So
but
when I arrived in New Zealand, I attended a seminar.
Raw products, right?
I attended a seminar when I arrived about 10 years ago, and a bunch of economists in the room, all much older than me, talking about productivity, the productivity paradox, and why it doesn't work. And anyway, I found this very interesting. I was new to New Zealand, and I said to one of the guys there, that was a really high-quality event. And he turned around to me and said, no, we've had this discussion for 30 years.
Yeah. Are we the only country who keep having this discussion? I mean, we are really rubbish at getting this right. Why are we not I always say, why are we not the IKEA of the Pacific?
The IKEA?
Well, yeah, because we've got raw logs sitting on I've talked about this forever, sitting on the waterfront. You know, we're exporting milk powder. Why aren't we exporting nutraceuticals? Why are we not? I mean, if we're going to rethink our trade strategy, we have to start thinking of us, you know, Fisher and Paykel Healthcare, of high-tech companies that can make us more money. It's obvious, and I say it, I'm almost boring myself just saying it because I've said it so many times. how do we get to that point?
Oh, there are so many things you have to do. In the long run, I think you need a better education system, because you cannot be highly productive if you're not educated. But I think that's a conversation for another day, because it will take too long and it's far too depressing. The other thing is actually we need to get much better at linking into international value chains. We don't do that. Yes, we are a relatively free trading country, but we are not a free trading country when it comes to investment. We've made it really hard for companies to settle in New Zealand, to come here. And unfortunately, if we don't have these international companies investing in New Zealand, we will struggle to link into their value chains. We will struggle to benefit from their expertise. So I think that's one of the ways in which you would start tackling productivity. And then the biggest obstacle, I think, domestically...
So make it easier for investment.
Yeah. Biggest obstacle to productivity in the long run, apart from education, is land. So I think as long as the land market is not working properly, and we have severe distortions there for a number of reasons. We've got planning legislation, the IMA, we have insufficient means to fund infrastructure. We haven't got the right fiscal incentives for councils to go for development, and all of this distorts the land market.
And we're very low in R&D, right? I mean, we have one of the lowest investments in R&D, which is partly to do with your investment argument, but it's also, I think, to do with incentives that government can give in the tax system.
Yes, but anyway, that's a discussion that New Zealand has had for 30 or 40 years, and probably a discussion for yet another conversation.
See, do you believe in top-down economics, or do you believe in... I believe in something called middle-out economics, where you invest in the stuff that I think you would agree. You invest in a good education system, in infrastructure, in skills, in training, in the sort of the idea that your economy grows from the middle out, not from the top down.
I'm not sure. If you give me that choice, I'd probably say bottom up. I think the economy should grow really bottom up from local communities, families, businesses, cities, communities. I'm a great believer in localism, as you know.
Yeah, which is where you and I first met. Furiously agreeing about localism, devolution. Yeah.
So I don't believe in top-down solutions.
I think that is a middle-out argument. I mean, it's saying that it starts from building communities from the middle out,
and I'm just simply distrustful of politicians promising great top-down programs and one-size-fits-all policies. Yeah. Typically, it's one-size-fits-none. So I think they have to become a lot more local.
Where we agree, coming from a left and a right perspective, is that top-down anything, whether it's top-down state or whether it's top-down economics of supply-side economics, it has to come from the community.
Exactly.
Up, right?
Yeah.
So
much agreement.
So much agreement. One last question. This is, or rather, I suppose it's a question, but one of my favourite jokes about economists forecasting is like, I think it was Galbraith again who said economic forecasting makes astrology look like a science, but so it's very hard to forecast, I know, and the other anecdote...
We got 10 out of the last 3 recessions right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Who did?
No, economists.
Oh, economists did, right.
My favorite joke is actually the 2 iron rules of economics. For every economist, there is an equal and opposite economist. That's rule number 1. And rule number 2, they're both wrong.
Right. My favourite economist joke is, shipwreck, end up on a deserted island and nothing to eat but a whole bunch of cans. And the economist, and what are we going to do? The economist goes, I've got a solution. Oh, great, what is it? First, imagine we have a can opener.
Exactly. No, I think that describes a lot of new classical economics.
So... we could do more jokes on economists, actually. But my question is, do you think inflation will hover at around 7% next year? Or will it go lower?
Yeah.
Or will it go higher?
According to John Maynard Keynes, he hoped for a single-armed economist, because economists usually say on the one hand and on the other. And for inflation, well, I mean, there are 2 ways you look at it. Some of the factors that were quite new to 2022 will probably subside. So we had the shock to international energy markets because of Ukraine. Some of that is already subsiding, at least internationally. For some European countries, it remains a problem, of course, if they haven't got the infrastructure to replace Russian gas. But more globally speaking, some of that might come down. Especially,
and Europe's done pretty well to replace that gas,
yeah,
right?
Not yet, struggling. But
yeah,
anyway.
But better than we thought. So
another way of looking at it is China is still slowing. That's not good for China. It's not good for the world economy, but it's good for energy prices. So demand, for example, for oil is slowing down in China. So I think energy prices might come off a bit. or at least not spiral anymore next year. So in that sense, inflation pressures might subside. The other thing happening, of course, is that central banks are slowly trying to increase interest rates. Now, on the other hand, it's probably not enough because we have enormous amounts of liquidity still in the world, and we have enormous amounts of debt. And when you put all of that together, and low growth, when you put all of this together, I think it is reasonable to assume that we will continue seeing inflation rates that are much higher than what we were used to. And having said that, they might still come down a wee bit. That's the best I can guess.
It's probably a pretty realistic forecast, I think. I've heard it's going to hover around 7% next year, which going into election year, and that's a whole other topic, Oliver.
That's a whole other topic, yes.
Can I tell you my favourite joke about Europe and Germans and British and French?
Sure.
And you can tell me if you think this is a racist joke, but the best Europe is the cooks from France, the police from Britain, and the engineers from Germany. And the worst Europe is the cooks from Britain, the engineers from France, and the police from Germany. Is that a racist joke?
I find it personally offensive because my dad was a policeman.
Oh, really? But it's a whole other discussion about when does national stereotyping become racist and when is it affectionate fun?
Yeah, I don't know, but I think we have totally run out of time now.
Totally run out of time.
So much for national stereotypes.
It's good night from him.
Good night. Do I have the last word?
You do have the last word.
Oh, thank you very much. In which case I say goodbye.
Goodbye.